I'm not here to tell you, Chad, like what masculinity is for you. I'm not here to tell any listener what masculinity should be for them. I'm an advocate for guys defining masculinity in a way that makes them feel masculine. We can explore this expression of masculinity in a curious, experimental, and open way.
Welcome to Safe to Love. We are on a mission to help the world believe in love again and give you the courage to find it. And I'm really excited about today's show. But first, I should note this episode is going to be a bit different. As you may have noticed, it's just me in the studio, and I don't have my beautiful co-host with me. Don't worry, though. April will be back next week, and I'll do my best to in her absence. So let me introduce our guest coming to us from the other side of the globe, my teacher, mentor, and friend, Cam Fraser. Cam is a certified professional sex coach, certified sexologist. He served as the Deputy Chairperson for the Society of Australian Sexologists from 2022 through 2024. Being a former Tantric Yoga Teacher, his work integrates scientifically validated, medically accurate information about sexual health with sacred sexuality teachings from the mystery traditions. As a coach, he helps men go beyond surface-level sex and into full-bodied, self-expressed, pleasure-oriented sexual experiences, free of anxiety or shame. So welcome, Cam.
Hey, mate. Thank you for having me, and it's really good to see you again, dude. I always enjoy having a chat with you.
Me too. Honestly, it's just a good excuse to get on the phone with you for an hour. So you want to tell us where you're coming from?
Yeah, sure, mate. So I live and work on Gubbi Gubbi country, which is the Sunshine Coast here in Queensland, Australia. And I am, delighted to be able to join you. It's 9 o'clock in the morning, so I've got my coffee in hand. And just wanting to pay respects to the elders past and present upon the lands of which I am.
Well, thank you for that. And I've always appreciated that practice, the way you grounded every call that we've ever had by honoring the traditional custodians of the land. And so I wanted to honor that today as well and say that I am recording on my end from the traditional ancestral homelands of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute nations. And just want to pay honor and respect to them. And we are going to talk today about masculinity. And, as people know, like this show is about relationships and how we have better relationships and how we show up safe in relationships and masculinity, and specifically our identity as men, our connection to our masculinity and the wounds with that is one of the biggest things that gets in the way of our ability to have deep embodied relationships. So I'd like to kind of start talking about what are some of the issues that you've seen? You've worked with a lot of men. This is a topic that you've talked about for a long time. And what are some of the issues you've seen of how men and the concept of masculinity and how men relate to that has affected their ability to have intimate and sexual relationships?
Sure, yeah. So I often find that, and this is true from my own lived experience, many men have a very narrow definition of what masculinity is. And that very narrow definition is oftentimes informed by a lot of cultural stereotypes about masculinity, like that men should not express their emotions, that men shouldn't cry, that men should be assertive and dominant. And then when it comes to, sexuality, that men should be knowledgeable and should be the instigators and the initiators of sex. And because that's the framework of masculinity for a lot of guys, and this was, again, true for myself growing up as well, that then lends itself to a lot of what I'll call shoulding, right? This is the way I should behave. This is the way I should show up in my relationship. This is the way I should be engaging in sexual activity with my partner. And when we have this shoulding, right? We should ourselves. We end up creating expectation and anxiety and assumption about both ourselves and our partners and the way that we're supposed to behave. That then can lead to things like performance anxiety in the work that I do. There's a lot of guys out there who think this is the way that they should behave sexually. This is what they should be doing sexually. And oftentimes some of those expectations are unrealistic and not very conducive for an enjoyable, mutually satisfying, mutually pleasurable sexual experience with their partner. And so they have a lot of anxiety about how they're performing their masculinity or performing their manhood when it comes to a sexual context. And that limits their ability to connect with their partner, limits their ability to like be present in the moment, because they're in their head worrying about, do they look manly enough? Are they behaving in a way that men are supposed to behave? Are they embodying this narrow definition of masculinity? So it inhibits connection. It inhibits pleasure as well. A lot of guys will minimize their own experience of pleasure in lieu of like surface level gratification. And so there's a disconnection, right? There's a lack of intimacy, and there's a minimization of like genuine erotic sensual pleasure. And so those, in my work specifically, what I've seen a lot of.
Well, and that right then and there is a topic that might even sound kind of counter to the conventional wisdom, right? Because the conventional wisdom, a lot of us hear, is that sex is all about men's pleasure. And a lot of women might especially find that shocking, that men's whole, like the whole experience of sex has been set up for men's pleasure. But as you said, the reality is that men are disconnecting themselves from their body a lot, and they're not even getting into their own experience of pleasure. And sometimes not even motivated by their own experience of pleasure when they're engaging in sex or they're pursuing sexual partners. And they're entering the bedroom being driven by wanting to feel like they're essentially playing the role right.
Yeah, the conventional wisdom, as you pointed out, mate, is that because of the orgasm gap, for example, it's evident that sex is for men and for men's pleasure, and women's is secondary. And what I want to do is make a distinction here between pleasure, which is full-bodied, genuine, authentic, sensual, erotic pleasure, and gratification, which is surface level, brief, temporary, not very satisfying. And what I find is that a lot of guys are focusing on, yes, their sexual gratification over their partner's sexual pleasure. And what happens then is we get a situation where guys are orgasming, ejaculating pretty regularly, but it isn't very fulfilling for them, and it isn't very meaningful, and it's not very intentional, and it doesn't feel very deeply embodied and sensual and erotic and all these other beautiful things that pleasure is and can be. And so in addition to that, what I also see is that there's a narrative around women's pleasure, that it is more intense, that it is more complicated and complex, and has more depth to it, has more nuance, and it's more expansive than men's pleasure, right? And we see this in sex educators do this all the time by saying like the clitoris has more nerve endings than the penis, even though they're homologous and have probably the same amount of nerve endings. And they talk about how like women are more emotional and how they're able to access more emotions and things like that. So we see the rhetoric that like women can experience things more intensely than men. And so then that lends itself to this narrative that orgasms and pleasure for women are more intense and more expansive. And then that does a disservice to men. But then also what I see with a lot of my clients, and again, this is a bit of selection bias here, is that those guys go into a sexual experience with their female partners and they kind of go, well, because they're adhering to this version of masculinity where I'm the person who has to do the thing to my partner, I'm the person that's responsible for her pleasure, I'm the person that instigates, that initiates, that kind of pursues sex, I'm the person that does the sex to her so that she has the pleasure. We see a situation where a lot of women in those contexts feel a lot of pressure to be experiencing pleasure, especially the pleasure that they've kind of been told, which is expansive and full-bodied and much more complex and complicated and deeper than men's pleasure. And guys going, well, I can't experience that, but my partner can, so I'm going to try and do the things that I can to try and get her to have that. And because a lot of these couples aren't talking to one another, we end up having a situation where women might be faking their pleasure, right? Because they feel like they should be, again, because there's shooting for men, there's shooting for women. They feel like they should be experiencing a certain amount of enjoyment or pleasure or satisfaction from sex, that they should be, getting off on what he's doing. And a lot of guys aren't having conversations with their partner about what she actually likes. And then, they're only focusing on just their ejaculation, just their kind of brief temporary orgasm. So they're focusing on their gratification. And I've been in so many situations with guys where we talk about sex, and very often the way that sex is talked about is about gratification for us. It's like, I came I busted the biggest nut. I fucking made her squirt. I made her, squeal. She was making all this pleasure. And so again, the way that sex is talked about amongst guys is like maybe exemplifying her pleasure, or like exaggerating her pleasure, right? And then just focusing on us busting a nut, right? And the surface level sexual gratification there. So we kind of get this, all of this kind of gets in this milieu of how men approach sex, which is by what I'll say, maybe disingenuously prioritizing their partner's pleasure, whilst also amplifying their own sexual gratification, right? And so we get a situation where sex is not that enjoyable for women because they are feeling like a lot of pressure to experience pleasure from something that their partner's doing, which oftentimes he doesn't really know what they're doing because we don't get a lot of really good quality sex education and technique and skills and know how to actually be a good sexual partner when that really comes down to communication. And a lot of these people aren't communicating with one another. And then guys are just focusing on their own ejaculation, not on everything else that's available to them. So I'm really an advocate for like breaking that pattern and going, all right, how can I explore pleasure in my own body? How can I explore sensuality, eroticism in my own body as a man? Because the more I can do that, the more I can be, the more I can access that and have that available to me, the more I can then share that with my partner, the deeper I can go with them into their pleasure, and the more open and vulnerable and intimate and exploratory and curious I can be about pleasure in general, which is more conducive to actually a mutually satisfying, mutually pleasurable sexual experience. But that is a big hurdle to jump over for a lot of guys because of the way that they conceptualize masculinity, right? To be a man is not to be sensual and erotic and in pleasure. Pleasure is, and sensuality and eroticism is, in my opinion, coded culturally as a feminine thing, right? As something that women experience. Men don't experience pleasure and eroticism and sensuality according to our kind of cultural scripts. That's for women. That's for the feminine. And if you were to do that as a man, again, the rhetoric is like, what, are you gay? Like I've had that said to me so many times when I talk about sex and sexuality a bit more erotically and sensually and focusing on that pleasurable experiences that we can have as a man. The retort I get from typically cis straight men is like, what are you, gay, bro? Like, why are you talking like that? That isn't how we as men have sex or talk about sex, right? So that's why I think masculinity in the way that it's, the stereotype of it, the way it's conceptualized for a lot of guys is very limiting and very narrow.
We're kind of taught this idea of sex as a conquest, right? And we're taught that, and we can kind of get into this later because it's really interesting to watch my son come of age and the way that this starts off as boys, right? Like they come back from a dance and him and his mates come back from the dance and they're all like, did you kiss her? Did you kiss her? Did you kiss her? Did you kiss her? They're not like these boys are so full of anxiety about, they're not even thinking like, I want to have this experience of kissing my partner and experiencing that. They like literally are thinking, I got to kiss her so that I get social acceptance, so that I'm not mocked, so that I'm, elevated in the status. And I think this is something that I'm surprised. I don't know how many women or even men really realize like how much of the sexual motivation of men starts at this adolescent age before even sex is on the table as a way of getting status with other men. And then we can focus in sort of the greater conversation. It's very easy to get distracted by the Andrew Tates of the world, right? Like the men that come out there and they're using women and they're cheating on them and they're exploiting them. And these, for great reason, like there's a lot of anger and animosity to them. But the reality is, from my perspective and my experience, that is the smaller minority of men. Most of the men that I've talked to care very greatly about their partner's pleasure. But that can be motivated not from a sense of caring, or not just from a sense of caring about their partner, but from a sense of identity, right? Like they want to feel like a man who sexually satisfies women. Mm-hmm. And I remember that being, in my early sexual debut, in my young adulthood, becoming obsessed with the idea of, oral sex, right? Of cunnilingus. and wanting so much, like having to go in, and also kind of having that fear in the back of my mind, like, I don't want to ejaculate before she does. I don't want to orgasm before she does, right? Like the book, She Comes First. So I would come in there and I would have, and in my 20s, honestly, this was not even an issue because I was also dealing with women who are in that sort of same level of their maturity of understanding their sexuality, right? We were like, so much of it, both of us were playing a performance, and I would come in there and I've got to go down on her first. I've got to make sure that she's had an orgasm before we have penetrative sex, just because then I've done my job. Then now I can go in there and I can get mine. And this sort of transactional idea of sexuality, even for a lot of men who maybe don't have that same sort of, douchey frat boy kind of mentality, is coded into the way that we do it. And what's ironic that I've really discovered later especially like in my late 30s, is that our ability, we're both going through that same situation, right? Like my pleasure is enhanced by my partner's pleasure, and her pleasure is enhanced by my pleasure. And so we're kind of both fighting this narrative where we talk about the orgasm gap, and we can talk about men who don't care about their partner's pleasure. But in reality, it's men caring so much about their partner's pleasure because of the way that makes them feel as a man, that's actually getting in the way of them being able to experience their own pleasure. And so then the most that we can do, like you said, is gratification, right? Like if I'm in my head and I'm doing a job and I'm focused on a job, I can give pleasure. I can make my partner have an orgasm, but that is so far below the level of pleasure that both of us can experience if I can get into my body and have that same experience. And one of the misconceptions and the narratives that we've really got to smash is this idea that men can't find the clitoris, right? We see that all the time. It's so fun. Men can't find the clitoris. Like, trust me, men know where the clitoris is. They're laser focused on the clitoris. What they don't know how to do is to take the long way there and get into their body and have and become really embodied in their own sexual experience and their own sexual pleasure, because that is the best way that we can actually give our partner a better experience.
I really appreciate that share, man, because that resonates with my experience as a younger man as well as a teenager. I was hyper-focused on how do I use my fingers? How do I use my tongue? How do I give my partner an orgasm? It was all about performance, right? And you flagged this with the way that your son and his friends talk about their experiences. It's all about, what did you do? Right. So what action have you done? What did you do to her? Not how did that make you feel? Right. Not like, how enjoyable was it for you to make out with her? How fun or how much pleasure did you experience in your own body? It's always about, what action did you take? What performance, did you put in? And that was true for my experience growing up as well. I was concerned with making her come first by using my fingers, by using my hands. But that was also partly because I was worried about how long I would last, when it came to penetration and ejaculating too quickly. And then there was a whole bunch of, formative sexual experiences that also involved alcohol as well, because I was worried about, lasting long enough. And so alcohol was a scapegoat for me to last longer, because that's what happens when you drink. And then that led to a whole other series of problems as well with regards to alcohol-induced impotence and whiskey dick and brewer's droop and things like that, right? So, but it was this focus on, what am I doing, not what am I feeling? And this is the shift in what I think needs to happen with regards to how men approach sex, which is, rather than focusing on what sex looks like, can we focus on what sex feels like, right? Can it be a shift from this performance to pleasure? Right. And that's like in a nutshell, my whole advocacy for men around sex is, can we move away from focusing on what sex looks like to focusing on what sex feels like? And to the, to the point around, I suppose, masculinity, to kind of bring it back to that, one of the things that is, I guess, like true across all realms of men's life is like performance, right? It's like, what are you doing, right? So I think of like the provider narrative, right? So how are you providing? What are you doing to provide the protector narrative, right? So again, what actions are you taking to protect someone? I've heard people call about like the presiding over the family, presiding over the household, right? So again, what actions are you taking? None of the discourse or rhetoric around like stereotypical, mainstream masculinity is about what's going on for you. Like, what do you notice internally? How are you feeling about these things? Can you identify some physical sensations in your body? All of the structures and framework around masculinity are about external things, right? Something that you're doing, performing, actions that you're taking. Very rarely is it turned inward to like reflect on what's going on for you internally. And so that's, again, one of the reasons why I think the very narrow definition of how we've conceptualized masculinity is detrimental to a lot of guys, right? Because it focuses externally about everything they're doing outside of their body and never really gives them the prompt to kind of reflect or go inwards.
Well, and we're kind of both of an age group. I'm a little bit older than you, but I grew up sort of at the tail end of the traditional masculine framework, right? The traditional sort of, like we're thinking like the Judeo-Christian sort of concept that dominated, the two-partner household for most of, like the modern history, and entered into this world where the internet took over, and then the internet has shifted things around there. And what I've observed is that there's so much out there about what not to do, right? We're at kind of as a society wanting to throw off maybe this older framework, and men are getting bombarded with all these ideas of what not to do, right? And again, it's just part of the internet rage machine, the way that hate posting posting something you hate gives it just the algorithm gives it just as much love in the algorithm as posting something that you love. And so things that enrage people and some of the more extreme rhetoric, if not more, right? The algorithm is not designed to build community and harmony in the world. Just, by the way, they get these images. Don't be like this. Don't be like that. Don't do this. Don't do that. And there's not a whole lot. There's this huge vacuum of, what do I do? Right? Like we sort of are the generation, my generation, the elder millennials, that said, we're not going to follow our parents' inherited structures of relationships and masculinity, but we didn't really have any idea what to fill that with. And in some ways that's left even more men more vulnerable and younger men more vulnerable and confused. And so I'm seeing fill that space now, and besides some of the more extreme rhetoric, which I think is important to talk about because it does affect a lot of men. But what I'm seeing more and more, especially in my peer group and men that want to they want to embody a more healthy view of masculinity, is this kind of neo tantric. It's not, neo isn't even the right word because it's sort of this fake like return to the old, right? Of this like healthy, super tantric sex man. And it's putting men in this different box, right? Where we now instead, like, our pleasure matters, your pleasure matters. We're in this divine sacred union, but there's still all this impetus on now. Instead of going in there and my job is to go down on her, and my job now is to go in there and hold this masculine energy and this container. And that has so much more appeal, and it really has a lot of appeal to women because they're craving that experience of safety, but it's still leaving men out of the loop of, well, what about, what do we need to feel safe in our body, right? Like, what is it like in order to go in and be that person? Like, what does the man need? And it's sometimes hard in these conversations. I know you get a lot of flack online for talking about what do men need? Like, what does a man need emotionally? And that's kind of left out there, right? Like, now we're just performing a different role. And so we've sort of shifted one mask for the other. And one thing that I've really noticed this a lot recently, especially since I've been dating April and brought a huge community in there, is a lot of people have seen our relationship and heard her talk about our relationship and know that I'm I work with men and it's a men's intimacy coach, and they will be like, you need to work with my boyfriend. You need to work with my husband. I want him to be like whatever you got. And I understand where that place is coming from, But the question that keeps coming up to me is like, do you know what he needs to be able to show up in that way? Right? It's still somehow not meeting the emotional needs of men. Like, and it's still on this kind of trope that men are simple, our emotions are simple, women's emotions are complicated. And so as men, when we have complicated emotions, our identity of masculinity just sort of shuffles those aside.
Yeah, there's a common metaphor for like this new age tantric, sacred polarized dynamic, if you will, which is that men are the pillar, right? And that women are the tornado that dances around the pillar, right? And so like men are supposed to be stoic and hold the space, and women are the ones that create the chaos inside the container and things like that. And that lends itself directly to what you've just pointed out, which is that's still a narrative that like men are simple. Men don't need to be held, right? They're the ones that do the holding, and that women are the ones that are complex and complicated and have the nuance and the depth. And so that, again, is just a repackaging of the exact same rhetoric that we hear about, men not showing their emotions and men not being, expressive and not crying and things like that, right? There's maybe a bit more fluff and spiritual jargon associated with it, but it's just repackaged. So yeah, I don't, and I understand that like there is that's appealing, right? It's appealing, that language. It's appealing to people when it comes to intimacy and sex, because it adds something more to sex, right? There's a bit more intentionality there. There's a bit more meaning associated with it. But I also think that it doesn't really go far enough. I don't think that it really lends itself to genuine and authentic connection for both people, because it's still putting people in boxes. And I know a lot of people who are, again, in their head about, oh, am I embodying this masculine pole enough? Or is my partner in her feminine enough? Am I doing the things that I need to do to put her in her feminine? It's like, man, you're just in your head again. You're not actually there, present, embodied, enjoying the experience with another human being in front of you. And so trying to let go of those, and again, move away from what it looks like to what does it feel like, right? Are you laughing? Are you having a fun time? Is it enjoyable? Does it feel good in your body, right? Like, can we focus on those things, right? The sensations that we're experiencing alongside our partner, rather than like, oh, am I performing this new age neo-tantric role of masculine energy and masculine polarity so that my partner is also performing? It just seems complicated and unnecessary, in my opinion, right? Where it's like, why don't we just get rid of that entirely and just focus on having a fun, enjoyable time regardless of what it looks like? And I think there's something to be said for like the this is a whole other tangent, but I think there's something to be said to learning from the kink community in that, right? Where they're just going to go like, fuck, this is what I'm into. This is why I like it, right? Let's just enjoy that. Rather than having to focus specifically on like, oh, am I doing the masculine role right? Am I doing the feminine role right? Queer, like there's so much to learn from the queer community around that as well, I think. But again, maybe that's a bit of a different tangential conversation.
Well, and I think, I don't, and me and you may not have the exact same perspective here, because I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater or the experience out with the dogma. I understand the appeal. It's an appeal that I've found myself, right? Like I've found this sense of masculinity that when I first kind of even got introduced to this world, that eventually led me to even working with you and taking your course on sacred sexuality for men, was with a woman who had been doing a lot of tantric work and we had got into this relationship, and I had experienced with her like a level of sex that the only way I could describe it, like when I would hear the words like polarity, and I would hear the idea of the masculine container and the masculine penetrator and all of these ideas, like it resonated with the experience that I had. That was really beautiful. And I still do believe kind of what David Dieta said in the intro to the book, Way of the Superior Man. Not one to promote David Dieta on whole, but in the bedroom, like one person has to be the ravisher and one has to be the ravishee. And that has been an experience that I have found to be aligned with my experience and has led to a lot of deeper pleasure. The problem I have is when it's portrayed as just another defined role. And now a man is like you said, instead of being in there thinking, am I big enough? Am I lasting long enough? Now am I solid enough? And when I have an emotion that comes up, because I'm still a real human being, of fear or insecurity or hurt or something that doesn't fit within the narrative of that, now I'm just kind of stuffing it down and trying to shift it away. And it does kind of lead to kind of the next topic I want to talk about is what do you believe is an idea of healthy masculinity, right? Like toxic and unhealthy and wounded masculinity is thrown around there, but what is your view of what healthy masculinity looks like?
Yeah, I think to tie this back into what you were just sharing, like we can explore this expression of masculinity in a curious, experimental, and open way, right? So the preference that you might have, as you've just shared, to be the penetrator, to be the ravisher, right, is like there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing inherently bad about that. And I think if we're aware of that desire and that preference, and we can kind of like explore that a bit more intentionally, meaningfully, consciously, if you will, by ourselves and also with our partner, then that is healthy masculinity, right? It's like finding ways to explore that with that openness and with that curiosity and with that intentionality and that mindfulness to go, hey, this is a version of myself that, I'm aware of, that I have a desire to explore, that I have a preference for. Can we do that consensually, respectfully with another person if they're on board with it, right? I think the lack of communication, the lack of curiosity, the lack of openness, and the lack of conversation about these things with a partner and just kind of jumping into it, assuming this is what is the right thing to do, what you should be doing, and that your partner is going to be on board with it without even talking about it, is unhealthy, right? If we want to use unhealthy and healthy as a bit of a binary system there. So like I'm an advocate for guys defining masculinity in a way that makes them feel masculine, right? I'm not here to tell you, Chad, like what masculinity is for you. I'm not here to tell any listener what masculinity should be for them, because again, that's just me boxing them in. I want to, again, from a client-centered, Rogerian approach, kind of go, what does masculinity mean to you? Tell me about that, right? And I'll get really clear. Use descriptive words. And some guys will say to me, yeah, it means being assertive. Great. Let's explore assertiveness. What does that look like for you? And assertiveness for some people looks like being commanding and telling people instructions and telling people what to do. And that's how they conceptualize being assertive. All right, great. Let's go down that pathway and find ways that you can do that in a way that's going to be consensual for everyone involved if it's a sexual experience, right? Or other people being assertive is like asking for what they want, right? And saying like, this is something that is really important to me. I would love to explore that with you, right? It's not commanding, it's expressive. And that's assertiveness to them. All right, great. Let's explore that. So it's getting granular into the specific things that make you feel like a quote unquote man or make you feel masculine. I had this really beautiful client the other day who was talking about what makes him feel masculine because he's in a relationship where his wife makes more money than him, is more successful in her career than him, and he's the stay-at-home dad. And he said that what makes him feel masculine is taking care of the house, right? And making sure that the house is cleaned and tidy and taking care of his kids, right? He says, what makes me feel masculine is knowing that I'm the one in the relationship that can get up in the morning, get shit done and take care of the kids because I fucking, I just get shit done. And he's like, so I wake up and it's on me, right? And I know that everything's going to be sorted while my wife goes out and makes a shitload of money. And I was like, awesome. That's great that this version of his expression of masculinity feels really good for him. How do we explore more of that, right? And in that particular instance, his wife was struggling to see that as masculine, right? Struggling to see him in his masculine by doing these things, by him taking care of the kids, by him getting up early in the morning, by him taking care of the household. And so it was about helping him step into that feeling, right? When you're in those moments where you've taken care of the kids, where the house is on point and you're feeling good, you're embodying that sense of masculinity. That's true for him. How can he connect with his wife in those moments? How can he connect with his wife to help her see him in his masculine during those moments? Because it's a two-way street, right? Because what makes you feel masculine might not look or be perceived by others as masculine, right? So if you're in a dyad with another person, we're going to have to take into consideration their experiences and assumptions and projections about masculinity as well. Because I don't want to, say that if you're just in your masculine, your partner's going to respond positively to that, because that's not always the case, right? So we have to take into consideration this other person and their projections, assumptions, and expectations and stereotypes around masculinity, because it's couples work, right? And the same thing goes for like femininity as well. If you're exploring something that's feminine as a woman, and something that makes you feel feminine is not what your partner might assume or stereotypically think is feminine, we got to talk to him as well, because it's a two-way street, and there's another person involved in their considerations and things like that. So maybe there's some educating that needs to do. Maybe there's some bias checking that needs to happen. I will stop there, because otherwise I'll rant at you, and I want to make this a two-way street.
Part of the issue too that I've had with women that will approach me and say, like in one form or another, like, I want you to make my man more manly, is that oftentimes what's happened in that dynamic is that the man has shifted his internal alignment to, what does my partner want? What does my partner want? What does my partner want? And I'm doing things now because I want someone else to say that they are good. And to me, healthy masculinity, and I say that with this recognition that a lot of things that feel masculine to me, that make me feel like a man, which is really important, right? I believe men want to feel like men. They want that feeling, that deep spiritual feeling is very important to us. And I want to try to help men experience that, is to be in alignment with my own self, to have my own values, to have my own boundaries, to have my own wants and needs, and to not be swayed by someone else's opinion at any given time. And that doesn't mean that we discount like our partner, but there's when women talk to me about the frustrations that they're having, the experience that they're having in the relationship that's leading to maybe a lack of sexual satisfaction, or a lack of sex at all, or also a lack of feeling trust and emotionally being leaned into the relationship. It always comes down to what they want their man to do is to follow his own heart, right? Is to follow his own inner world, to have his own values, to do something, and even when that may not be what she wants him to do. And this may be something that shifts more like later in life. But so it's kind of this paradox where if it's like, well, I can't come to a man, like I would tell them, like, give him my number and have him call me. Because if for a man to want to grow into that space, he has to do it for his own reasons, right? And it's really difficult when we're in relationships. We've been in relationships, especially if the relationships we've been in a long time, or we're single and we're kind of seeking new relationships, right? We're wanting someone else to tell us, like, give me the formula that I can do, and then somebody else tell me that I did being a man right. Someone tell me that I did it well. And the embodied experience that both women and men are wanting to have, men of wanting to feel wanted, desired, and I would describe it as that feeling of a woman surrendering to you, and women wanting to feel that experience of feeling safe in someone else's presence, to surrender to it, to feeling just all these things that are tied into some inherent sexual drive are impossible if we're not doing it for our own reasons, right? If we're doing it to make someone else happy. And so when a relationship starts to get into this place where maybe both partners are feeling this fear of the other one abandoning them or leaving the relationship, or they're just feeling a fear about the relationship in general, and they both sort of show up in that way, it's inherently unmasculine. And so a lot of the impetus then goes on the man, because then if the sexual chemistry isn't happening and sex isn't happening, it's because he's not being dominant enough, right? And I love this idea of DOMs, kind of going back to the kink community, right? Because like a lot of men want to be dominant, but dominance in the actual sense of a dominant submissive sex relationship, which from my experience, like at least 90% of the people that I've met that are cisgendered, heterosexual, that is their biggest kink, right? Like men are very much aroused by the act of being dominant. I know that's very much true for me. And women are very much aroused and drawn to the submissive role. But in a real dom sub relationship, the sub has just as much power. It is this willing surrender. It is this voluntarily choosing. It is saying, you have earned my trust, like the inherent trust of my body, that I want to open to you and let you have your way with me, not because you have shown up in a way that you're not going to take from me. But we can't do that if what we want to take from a partner is our own validation. As soon as we get back to that place where sex for a man becomes validation, going all the way back to boyhood, right? To when your boys were teasing you if you kissed the girl, and we want our partner, sex becomes about validation for men, especially in like long-term relationships, way more than it's ever really talked about. And that is a taking, right? I want you to come to me and make love to me so that I can feel whole. That is, even if my motives are to serve you and to please you and to take care of you, is that essentially is coming from this taking energy. And so for a man to be like my concept of healthy masculinity is someone that is grounded in their own self. Like we have to have that as our inherent worth, so that we can then be able to be receptive to what our partner wants. And if our partner doesn't want this, then we don't take that as rejection, right? And that's why rejection is so kind of culturally difficult for men, right? Because the rejection isn't just, I'm not going to give you pussy. It's, you're rejecting me as a man worth sleeping with, which I have been conditioned at a very young age to believe is how I find my value and worth.
Yeah, I appreciate that share, mate. And there's a few things that come up for me. One is around, so that point that stood out to me around, the majority of men wanting to be dominant and the majority of women wanting to be submissive, or, getting aroused by that or desiring that. I think my interpretation of this is confidence, right? We find someone sexually attractive if they're self-assured and confident in their sexuality, right? And so you could be confident in your, you could be confident in your skills to be dominant and assertive, right? And in that position of power, and you could really own that and be self-assured in that and know that that's okay and that you can hold that space. And you can also be confident in your and self-assured in your desire to let go and surrender, to use that word, and to be the ravishee and to have someone take charge of a sexual situation. So I don't, in my interpretation of things, I don't necessarily think it's like the roles per se that people are interested in. It's the confidence in that, because I also know plenty of people who have been in situations, and these are male clients of mine, who are very self-assured and confident in their desire and their sexual and erotic blueprint to be the person who is, on the receiving end of pleasure, on the receiving end of some type of sexual activity, to maybe be in that more passive and receptive role. And they're like, confident about that. They're assertive about it. Like, hey, this is what I like. I like to be touched in this particular way. I like to, be in this particular position. I like to be tied up, right? Whatever. And it isn't necessarily, their role per se that is attractive to a sexual partner. It's the fact that, like, dude, that's a person who knows what they want. And similarly, like I've seen couples where that female partner is like wanting to take charge and feels sexy and confident stepping into that position of assertiveness and dominance, if you will. And, I've seen guys respond to that and be like, holy shit, I didn't know that I was going to get turned on by that. But damn, like that's, there's something about that that's erotically charged and like attractive and a turn on, not because of the role, but because that's a woman who's stepped into her sexual power, if you will, right? To use that language that I know is common in these spaces. So I think like self-assuredness, confidence, and then also there's something to be said for competency as well, knowing what you're doing in those situations as well, right? And being able to own that, I think is, again, in my interpretation of things, something that people are drawn to, not necessarily like the roles that are assigned to them. But there's an overlap, of course, right? I think there is an overlap, and there is something to be said for, guys leaning towards being in a position of power, right? And that power play is a big part of a lot of people's relationships. But I just don't think that that's the core. I think the core is the people that are attracted to the confidence, the competency, the self-assuredness in those roles. I do highly agree with you, though, on men seeking... Oh, I was just going to say around men seeking the validation from their partners. I think as men, we place a lot of stock in, are we being sexually chosen, right? And are we, and then beyond that as well, like, are we good at sex? And that's, and I think back to like my own adolescence, sex for me was conquest, and it was quantity over quality. Right, because I was seeking, I think a lot of teen boys do, like, am I a man enough, or am I worthy enough as a man to have a multitude of sexual partners? Because my self-worth was dependent upon how attractive I was to women, how much women were wanting to have sex with me, and then also, which is where it gets a little bit more problematic as well. It's like, how many women could I convince to have sex with me as well, right? Like, that's where we get into maybe some of the manipulative and coercive kind of behaviors of men as well, where we place so much emphasis on sexual validation that we'll do whatever we can to get it because of how much emphasis we're placing upon it, because of the way we've conceptualized masculinity in our male circles.
Well, I think there's a lot of sample bias in my perspective, if I'm being honest, because I haven't had a lot of younger clients, and a lot of my experience has been in social media spaces and real spaces with men in the middle age, mid 30s to late 40s. And so I don't see, I've seen from my limited worldview, a decline somewhat in the popularity of that, the old school, the game, right? The pickup artist treat, right? Of this, like, just like manipulating women into sex is kind of maybe that's still showing up quite a bit, but that's the world that I grew up in, right? And like we talk about patriarchy, right, as a system. Like, men are not patriarchy. I am not patriarchy. You are not patriarch. Collectively, we're not patriarch. Patriarchy is a system. It's a system that has placed men in places of power over women, in places of advantage and dominance over women, and systemic advantage. But ultimately, men are still under this oppressive system, right? And so we grow up in this world where a woman's value is based upon her purity, right? And this was kind of the extreme case in Utah, where I grew up, in the LDS culture, where young girls would be in Sunday school and they would have a teacher come out with a piece of bubble gum and then chew the bubble gum and then say, but the idea being, if you let someone have sex with you, you're now chewed bubble gum. But socially, through many different cues, many of them at school and in our social groups, but also a lot of them from traditional media and then from social media as that became popular, that our value is the notches on the bedpost. I tell people all the time, like, I have never seen a movie that more describes at least the culture around sex and how that shaped me that when I grew up than American Pie, right? And the scene where Stifler comes in and says, "I'll see you guys in the no fucking section," right? Like the whole show is these boys seeking sex, not for any reason other than this desperation to not fail at being whole members of society, right? Like literally to not be seen as a failure. The Superbad is another great example of that, right? Like the whole time he's just freaking out, like we can't go to college as virgins because that would be the worst thing to be. And all of the programming of that, it sticks with men, even as we consciously outgrow that. It unconsciously sticks with us that like I am not whole and worthy unless a woman wants to have sex with me. And that's something that I work really hard with in myself and with clients to break, because as long as that's our motivation for sex, like a person can feel that. And I've been on the other side of that, right? Like I've had the experience of, a lot of people talk about how men don't handle rejection, but really sexually, right? And we're not talking about like dating, but when it comes to sex, women, I've been with a lot of women that had never experienced rejection before me. And by that, I mean like had never wanted to go farther sexually than the man did. And when I would say, no, I don't want to go that far. I want to stop here. A lot of women didn't take that very well. And it wasn't that they were experiencing this feeling of what's wrong with me. Right. So when you say, no, I don't want to have sex with you, it's what's wrong with me. And as long as we're bringing that energy, and I can feel that energy, from my partner when when a partner wants to have a sexual experience with me to fulfill her sense of self-worth. And it is a huge anti-aphrodisiac. Like what really brings about like the ability to surrender as a man from the position of dominance or submissiveness is this confident feeling of freedom. Like I want freedom in this. I want to come into the sexual act. I want to be able to have my boundaries. I want to be able to flow with them. I want to be able to do what feels good within your boundaries and your needs, and know that if I don't want to do something, that's okay. You're not going to take that in a way that's going to turn into a fight or something. And that's what I hear underneath these desires, but that people don't really understand them very well. So they come out as in, I want my man to be more dominant, or I want you to show up this way, or I want, I even had a partner that was really, quite frankly, lost in this kind of tantric neo-polarity world, and would just send me these videos of these couples that she followed that were polarity influencers, and be like, you should be doing this, you should be doing that, you should be doing this. And what really is underneath that is like, what do people want to feel? What do men want to feel from intimacy and sex? What do women want to feel from intimacy and sex? And I believe that, like you said, that's where that confidence is sexy. Whether it's like for both men and women, that confidence is sexy, because that confidence, if you know who you are when we make love, then however that turns out, you're going to still feel the same way you do about you, and it takes that pressure off of the act to fulfill a sense of identity or worth in each partner.
There's a concept that I want to introduce here, which we've kind of alluded to but haven't explicitly named, which is the man box. And the man box is like this unwritten set of rules that a lot of men feel like they need to follow in order to, quote unquote, be a man, right, in the stereotypical sense of the word. And a lot of that behavior is policed by other men. But what I don't think gets acknowledged enough is that a lot of that behavior is also policed by women. And so in that situation that you've just described, mate, where, one of the man box rules, or unwritten set of rules, I suppose, if you will, is that men should always be interested in sex. That they should always say yes to sex, because that's what it means to be a man, right? Is that you want no strings attached sex, and you'll always be happy to get off, because that's how the man box conceptualizes masculinity. And the situation where you say no as a man to sex butts up against that man box, right? For women who also have many of the same preconceived notions about masculinity as we do as men. And we get a situation where, and I've been in a similar circumstance where I've said no to sex, and my partner at the time said, well, what's wrong with you? Why don't you want sex? What, like, and again, and this goes to show how pervasive kind of like homonegativity is in our society. But also the rhetoric was, what are you, gay? You don't want to have sex? Are you gay or something? Right? Like that was language that was used by a woman to police my behavior, right? About how I show up as a man in accordance to the unwritten rules of the man box. So yeah, there's again a lot of shoulding that happens where you should behave this way, right? The videos that you're getting sent, well, this is how you should be behaving. This is what you should be doing in our relationship. And again, it's policing behavior. It's putting people in boxes. And again, to use that phrase, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. If that feels like a nice, enjoyable, comfortable box for you and your partner feels enjoyable and authentic and genuine being in this other box, and you guys are in a happy, stable, enjoyable relationship there, go for it, right? Like, I'm not here to tell you that you can't explore those things. I think there's some bad faith arguments out there that, like, feminism doesn't want you to be, a submissive, receptive housewife type, figure. And it's like, no, that's not the case. We just go, firstly, why do you feel like you have to be that way? Have you ever thought otherwise? And secondly, are you doing what's making you feel good? Does it feel enjoyable, happy, fulfilling, meaningful, pleasurable for you? If it does, all the power to you. Great. You can make that choice. Awesome. Right? Same thing goes for guys. Say to the guys, like, if you want to explore that dominant, stoic, emotionless side of you, and that feels good for you, and it's not harmful and detrimental to you, because in some cases it can be, then great, step into that. All the power to you. I'll support you in that, right? But have you considered this? Have you considered unpacking it? Have you noticed any other ways that this might be detrimental to you, right? Like, let's just explore it a bit more. But if at the end of the day you land on that position that feels good for you, and you've got the tools to be able to, like, feel resourced and supported in that, great. I'm going to be, happy for you, right? As long as you're not harming others, as long as you're not projecting that onto people who don't want it to be projected onto. Like, there's so many ways that we can still explore these versions of our masculinity, our femininity, our gender expression, to use that language. Like, there's just, I think the problem becomes when that becomes so narrow, limited, and then also gets projected onto others, where we have to say, this is what you should be doing. And I think that then causes anxiety, expectations, and assumptions that we don't need.
Well, and I'd even argue that even if that is the expression that we align with, as soon as that becomes a thing that must be, and that can be maybe that, like, those are the conditions. Like, I find that I've, surprisingly, for somebody who in my expression for my whole life has been very balanced between masculine and feminine, that in sexually, I find myself very in this traditional masculine space. Like, I seem to have, I tend to naturally pair with women who want to be submissive in sexual encounters, and I like I get a lot of pleasure and fulfillment from that surrender and from being in charge, and not in charge to take from something, but just in the feeling of power and trust that comes into that. And it's honestly sometimes hard to explain, but I can picture that feeling in my mind, right? But then when I don't feel grounded, when I don't feel confident, right? That even if we've created a box of our masculinity and our expression, and we've found a partner that aligns within that space, we are still human beings, and we're never going to be able to show up that way all the time. And when it becomes a thing that we have to do now, not just to have fulfilling sex, because a lot of that may not be really in our control, right? Like learning, improving our sex lives is way more about just curious discovery than it is following any kind of paradigm or dynamic, right? Like, we may find that, like, I'm aroused when I'm feeling confident, and she's aroused when I'm feeling confident and she's feeling submissive or whatever. And when we're not in that space, then maybe there isn't a sexual energy and arousal in that moment, but it's still, I haven't lost any inherent worth. And as soon as we tie, like, arousal and sexual satisfaction to worth, which we've been having done to us, like, we have that tied to us, right? Like, we have to start to untie that. then that's when it gets in the way of our ability to have like continued sustained relationships, right? So some people may come into this space, find that they align in this role, or it may be in an opposite role, or it may be in a mixed and blended role, and it really works out. But we're 4-dimensional complex beings, and when our shit comes up and then we don't play the role, even if it's a role we both agree to, then suddenly everything falls apart. And that's where, I found a lot of value in some of these newer ideas of polarity and masculinity, but at the same time also rail against them as an idea of rules or shoulds. One question I wanted to ask you before we get to the end here is, because me and you both, we work a lot with a lot of men. I know your course, Cam Fraser's School of Sacred Sexuality for Men. I believe I got the title right. That I was lucky enough to be in the pilot year of, and I think you're now about to enter in your 5th year. Is about coaching men. I imagine that a lot of the people that listen to your podcast are men. Before I got onto this podcast, a lot of the work that I kind of had niched myself to working with men, right? Wanting to help men. But Safe to Love really is a podcast for men and women. And I'm curious, like, what do you wish that women understood more about the inner emotional lives of men?
I think it would be that there is so much pressure, right? We are able to acknowledge socially, culturally, that there is so much pressure on women to behave a certain way, as you pointed out before from your experience as an adolescent, with the LDS community. There's all this pressure on purity for women, right? And to behave as a woman should behave, and that is coming from a lot of external sources, and that women feel a lot of that pressure and expectation and weight. And that's also true for men, right? That there are a lot of other, it's gendered, of course, but there is so much pressure that men are feeling to behave a certain way. And a lot of the men that I speak to are anxious all the time because of the pressure they feel to behave in a way that is deemed man enough or masculine enough, or performing masculinity in the right way. And, whether guys are kind of able to acknowledge it or not, the more I speak to men in groups and one-on-one, the more I hear from them that they are tense, anxious, concerned at all times about how they're showing up as a man. And they feel that immense weight and pressure and expectation and assumption from everywhere, from their partners, from their kids, from society in general. And they feel like they can't not perform that masculinity. Right. And they to this point, like, we can't do that all the time. There is many instances throughout the day, throughout the week, throughout our life where, like, we just can't be this version of masculinity that maybe we are aspiring to be. And to be able to be human for a few moments and let the mask down, to let the guard drop, and to just not be and not have to be this version of masculinity is something that I think a lot of guys are craving and wanting, but are also fearful of, because of what that might mean to the people around them, because they've so bought into this is how men should behave all the time, and this is what they should be doing. So I think, like, just recognizing that there is pressure, anxiety, expectation that a lot of men are feeling internally that they maybe might not voice in the same way that women are, right? From different societal forces and expectations and narratives, I think is one thing I would really love for women to take into consideration, for all people to take into consideration. But of course, your question was about women. And I think, that lends itself to empathy, right? Like, if we can be more empathetic about people's lived experiences and, like, what's brought them to this point.
And, it's kind of similar to the response that I would give to that, which is, men, we want the same thing. like part in partnership. We want sex, we want intimacy, we want companionship, we want partnership. We have to throw out this whole idea that we're coming to this transactional role of sex. Like men are even like more and more starting to become conscious of that, right? Like this conversation, even it's crazy how quickly it's evolving. I might have a completely different message a year or two ago, but men are coming to this place of, I want to feel that way. I want to show up for you that way. Like as a man, it feels good when I show up in a way that like women want us to show up. But I would invite them to ask their partners the question, like, what do you need to be able to show up that way? Right. Because just wanting to, and knowing the place we want to get to or want to perform, but without really feeling able to do that, knowing how, or feeling emotionally safe or supported, then all we have is one more thing that we feel a sense of failure on. And the feeling of failure is the number one driver of men's suicide as an extreme, but like the emotional depression and the emotional problems of men that can manifest in many different ways. Alcoholism, or it could go to the other extreme of violence, is this feeling of failure, right? And so asking your partner, what do you need from me? What does he need in general in order to be able to show up in the way that I need, rather than just thinking they have to convince their partner to want to. Like almost to a T, every man that I've met wants to show up in the way that every woman that I've met says she wants a man to show up to. Like we are more or less aligned on the same goals.
And that's why we do this work, right? With fellas, is because there is a need for men to unpack these things as men with other men, right? Like I don't want to fall into the trap of just putting all the expectation on women to create safety for their male partners, right? I don't want that to be the message here that people take away. It's like, as guys, we got to be supporting one another to do the work internally, to have these conversations, to unpack things, to find out what it is that we need to feel safe, so we can then actively and effectively communicate that to our partners, right? It isn't our partner's job to read our minds to figure out what feeling safe means for us so that then they can deliver that for us. It's for us to go, fuck, what do I need in these moments? How can I advocate for myself? How can I show up in my fullness and communicate what it is that I need, and then also help facilitate that for my partner and be curious about those things. So, I often hear from my more progressive circles like, this is just men asking women to do more emotional labor for them. And I don't want to fall into that trap, right? I want to really be clear that what we're advocating for is like for guys to do that work, to do it amongst ourselves, so that we can then bring that to our relationships and have those communications and conversations with our partners. And that's been true for me, at least anyways. Like the amount of opportunities I've had to do the work internally to then bring that into my relationship has been fantastic. My wife has done the same thing. She goes and does her work, and then she brings it into the relationship. We both take accountability and responsibility for our shit, and then we try to effectively move through that together and have those conversations. And one of the things I wanted to just close out with, mate, was, David Data. I'm not the biggest fan of him, but if I could push back on that specific remark that he made about there always having to be a ravisher and a ravishee, immediately what comes to my mind is like, why can't there be two ravishers in this situation? What about if it's mutual masturbation? Who's the ravisher and ravishee in a mutual masturbation scenario, right? I'm like, again, to sum up my opinion, like I don't think universalities are helpful, right? It's like, does there always have to be this and this, or are there instances where we can just think outside the box a little bit more? So not to throw too much shade on David Data, but I'm like, hey, universalities, not a big fan.
No, I could not agree more with exactly the way you phrased that. In fact, dogma, I'm dogmatically opposed to dogma. I guess what I find is that, and I think this is just the reality in doing work with men and women, that, meeting people that like, why is so much of that work popular amongst men and women? And it's because it's resonating with some lived experience they're having. And I like to try to understand what that lived experience is, because otherwise it's kind of this whole association thing. Someone comes along and says, well, sex is good when one of you is pursuing and the other's receiving. And if someone says, yeah, that's actually been my experience, right? I'm sexually satisfied when I'm pursued as a woman, then you might start to believe every other dogmatic thing that comes out of their mouth. And that's where I think a lot of the problems is, right? People will touch on, and not just with men, but like, it's really a real problem, I think, in a lot of the male side of the polarity influencers, right? Like, they have a lot of great, helpful things to say. They help a lot of men have better experiences of pleasure and show up differently in relationships, and then suddenly decide that means they're experts on everything. And, the one other thing I just want to say, and I'm really glad that you brought that up, because you and I know that's not what I mean, but it is very important how that is taken. And when I talk about asking the question, what does my man need to be able to show up for me the way that I want him to show up for me, I am not just exclusively talking about from his partner. In fact, a lot of that, the answer to that question is often going to be not from anything from you, right? Like, I'm a big believer that we as men, and why, I've got into this work full time, and why you do the work we do, right? Like, it's our job to hold emotional space for each other, right? It's our job as men to start to build connections with each other, to form communities, to take on the mentorship role of coaching, to be leaders and advocates for each other, because so many men have never opened up vulnerably to anybody but their intimate partner. And that dynamic turns their intimate partner into their therapist. And that's a killer of intimacy, right? So that question might be, what does my man need to be able to show up in the way that I would like him to show up? And it might be he needs to find a community of supportive men to take on some of that labor, so I'm not doing all the emotional labor. And how can I support that? Right. It kind of like, that question kind of leads to a place of empowerment, not just, what does he need from me? Because really, and that's why, men's work has been something that I've really been pushing, why I'm going to be launching a men's group myself soon. I've been a part of a number of them, and I just really don't think we can have enough of them right now, because I've seen in those spaces when men come together and create a safe space to be vulnerable with other men, we are able to go out and show up radically differently in relationships with our children and with other women. And this is the work that we should be doing together. So, I want to leave you with one last question. It's a question we ask every guest, but, what's one piece of advice you'd leave our audience with to give them hope and love?
Oh, man. Usually my go-to answer for any question like this is, how can you cultivate curiosity, right? And so everything I've spoken about today, if I could sum it up, is like, how can you be curious about your experience of masculinity? How can you be curious about the way that you're approaching sex? How can you be curious and ask questions about the experience that your partner's having sexually? I think if we can make curiosity the cornerstone, the bedrock of our approach to all of these things, then, the answers that we receive to those questions can better inform the way that we experience our relationship, the way that we experience intimacy and sex, the way we experience our own relationship with ourselves, right? So I think curiosity is going to serve you well. It's going to lead to more safety. It's going to help you ask questions, and it's going to contribute to like a thriving long-term relationship. If you continue to be curious over your lifespan, over the span of your relationship, things are going to shift and change. And if you can continue to hold on to that curiosity, that's not going to phase you, right? You're going to be open to that. So it's going to lead to, it's going to lead to love, right? It's going to lead to safety. It's going to lead to the relationship that you really want, but it has to come from that genuine, authentic place inside of you that's curious about these things, that wants to learn more. So that's probably what I would suggest.
I think that's probably one of the best answers I've got yet. And let's figure out a way to make curiosity masculine, make it manly again, especially with that inner world, right? And courageously look within. Well, thank you so much, Cam. And have a great rest of your day. And I just want to leave everyone, remember everyone to be brave. Love is worth it.